I'm going to begin with a reading by a man named Eckhart Tolle. Is anyone here familiar with Eckhart Tolle? Yes, several. Okay. Eckhart Tolle is a teacher of spiritual consciousness and wrote a book called The Power of Now. He is appealing for a Unitarian Universalist in many ways because he's not religion-based. Although he teaches similar, different of course, but kind of the principles that the Dalai Lama teaches, principles of higher consciousness, how we access higher consciousness, how we develop our own consciousness towards more and more compassion, more and more stillness, more and more being in the present. I went to a conference with him in June of 2015, and this is from the 7th session. The creation comes from within the person to the outside. It does not come from the outside in. Fullness comes from being in touch with presence. New consciousness will be contributed to simply by embodying it. The two are together. You must be deeply aligned with the present moment, and the creation will come. Any resistance will stop the flow. What wants to be created through me will become apparent. The answer may already be in you, and you may already be engaged with it. Enjoyment is a key if the activity is right for you. It will tell you that this activity is going to bring you joy and is meant to come through you, and that it is not an ego activity, something your mind has made up to keep you busy. Writing the book, The Power of Now, was a great joy. High energy flowed. My little ego could never have written that book. You don't need an outcome to be in joy and high consciousness. It won't satisfy you. Joyful creation reconciles the two. The inward return to the source and the outward manifestation. I'm going to talk today spiritual courage in the 21st century. Body, mind, body, heart, and consciousness. Oops, there it is. Is it working okay?
Yeah.
I just heard it. I'm going to talk briefly about comparing the age we're living in now in the 21st century as probably the most unique age since the axial age of the creation of the religions of the world, which was 500 years before the Common Era to 500 years after the Common Era. They changed that a few years ago. It's no longer before Christ and after Christ, you know. So I'll talk briefly about that. I believe that the chaos that we are in, that seems so difficult, we can't make sense of half the time, is really a predictable event. That the laws of nature have driven us to an evolution of humanity that now we are called on to respond to. And then my answer to how do we respond? That the spiritual courage of our hearts and our bodies and the consciousness that's coming through us from the inside out is the call we have been given. In order to tell my story, I have to go back to 9/11. 9/11 happened, and I was actually in Racine doing my internship at a wonderful church. If you ever have a chance to go to church in Racine, at the Unitarian Church with Tony Larson, it's wonderful. That's where I did my internship. And the honest truth is that of course the phrase was, all of us who lived through it as adults, you will remember, everything's changed. Everything's changed. And I kept hearing, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. And I was so interested in that. It just kept coming through my intuition. I just kind of accepted it and worked to make sense of it. And I think in the end, what the sense I made of it is this. I'm a undergraduate, I was a sociology major. And in sociology, you study the patterns of things, how human beings behave in patterns, what's predictable about patterns of behavior. So that things like, the world was round, even when we didn't understand it was round. That pattern was already in play for the people who lived during the era where they thought the world was flat. So there are things that are true, even though we don't know they're true. Gravity was at work even when we didn't understand it. There was a law of gravity, and finally Newton sat under his apple tree, and the apple fell, and he figured it out. But gravity was still true way before that. Vaccines could prevent illness, even when we didn't have that science yet. Or they didn't even know what a vaccine was. It was in the air. It was coming to us. It was a possibility that we didn't even know about yet, but it came when we were ready to. When we let our consciousness let it in and create it. That's what Channing's talking about, that letting things come through us in new consciousness, letting go of the old. In my opinion, what we're living through now is the result of natural laws, physical laws, and mystical laws that are always at work. The 21st century has emerged more and more to convince us that things are changing, and that these laws that we sort of understand but are beginning to understand better are coming to us in new ways. So a science law, for example, we grow up from children to adolescents to adults. We watch people change. The young people themselves are feeling all these changes, but we know it's very predictable. This is what's going to happen. This is not new. In a way, it's not new. It's new for that person, and it's certainly new for the family that's parenting them. How do I work with it? But the phenomena really isn't new. A mystical law is like the necessity of forgiveness. We have come to understand that forgiveness is a natural state of the human heart. We've all needed to forgive and to be forgiven. And we come to understand how important that is in moving forward in life and in relationships. As a chaplain, any stories I tell, I'm changing the story so that the person, isn't recognizable. But many years ago, I had a woman dying in the hospital, and she had talked to her doctor. They had a big plan in place. It was all going to be palliative. She was going to be dying in the next 2 or 3 weeks. They were going to move her to the assisted living area, but she was going to be in the hospital over the weekend. And I came to see her as a chaplain, and she revealed to me, which she had told no one else, she had an estranged son. He hadn't been to see her in 15 years, and she wanted to reach out to him and let him know she was dying. And her other children were angry with him and didn't want to have anything to do with him. So she wanted me to help her figure out how can she reach out to this other young man, not young man, I don't think, but see if he would come to see her before she died. So we worked on it, and that was a Friday. I came in on Monday, and we were going to talk more about it. And over the weekend, she decided to tell her children that's what she wanted. Would they please get a hold of their brother, tell him what was happening, and tell him she wanted him to come. So then a couple days went on. She went to the assisted living area, and I went to visit her there about a week later, 2 weeks later maybe. And I said to her, well, did your children go? Did your son come? And she said, yes, they told him he hasn't come. He won't come. But then she said, but what I know is in my heart, I've forgiven him. And I think 1 or 2 of my other kids are beginning to. So even if he never shows up, I'm dying in peace. That was a profound experience for her, and she did what she needed to do at the end, even if her son never came. So this is an era when Barbara Marx Hubbard, are people familiar with Barbara Marx Hubbard? She is a futurist, and she talks about how we are in a new stage of human evolution. And the stage of human evolution is this, that all the ways that we have been living don't work. Many of them don't work anymore. That the world that we've created, and this is shared by many futurists, and is gotten to the point where we're destroying ourselves, the planet, or like the Earth has an autoimmune disease, hurting itself, and that what we need to do is create a new story, a new pathway through science, through many projects, which I'm sure many of you are involved in and people around the world are involved in. She gives the example of saying that evolution happens when the pressure is placed on humanity or on nature. She talks about, and the scientists here will excuse me, I'm going to colloquialize this story. I'm sure it's a much better way to say it scientifically. Initially, the world was covered became covered with single cells. Single cells inhabited the Earth. But at some point, the single cell, there were too many of them, and they didn't fit anymore. And they began kind of crowding each other out. And then, according to the scientists, the chlorophyll molecule inside the single cell found a way to take what the sun was giving it and create photosynthesis. And pretty soon, they were creating multiple cell organisms all over the Earth. And that began a whole new process that led to plants and animals and human beings. So what she is saying is the pressure on the system is what creates solution. And we think to our own families and our own lives, and we can see that. When there's pressure, all of a sudden you're forced to deal with things that maybe you hadn't dealt with before. So her position, and the futurists I've read about, Hazel Henderson I just found recently, I thought her stuff was very interesting, is saying, okay, now there's pressure on us that wasn't on us before, and all of us, we've got their attention. It's got our attention. We know that we need to find solutions. I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about history. I want to do another thing with history. That axial age of change for religion, those are religions. All these religions came up during that time. This included Buddhism, included humanism with Socrates. It included, Jesus was born and humanity created Christianity out of that. And then Muhammad and Islam are kind of the big ones around that period. They were all brought forward. Judaism was the very first one, beginning to say, we don't have to just live this experience of drudgery. There is a higher power beyond us, which we can relate to. So this was a huge time of change for humanity. All of a sudden, they created a sense of something bigger than themselves, or something that they felt defined humanity in a new way, intellectually, through humanism, or through these different religions. Well, what's important now is that I think we're in that same kind of time. We are in a time where everything has to change, that we're being forced to come into new ways of being and new ways of living as a result of what's going on in our world. The Age of Reason, the Enlightenment period, which to a great extent Unitarian Universal principles are based on, came to an end, I would say, when the nuclear bomb was dropped on Japan. It wasn't just dropped on Japan, of course, it was dropped on the whole globe. And as a result, we've all begun using reason and common sense to work things through. We know we can't do that with a nuclear bomb. It hasn't worked, We're still struggling with how to handle that. And so those kinds of situations and problems began to develop. So what happened next was that a great deal of the world was in kind of old religions. And certainly Unitarian Universalism was one of, we could be so proud of ourselves. We began some new thinking around all that, kind of here way before the nuclear bomb. And all of a sudden, people are beginning to, cope with, how do we find a sense of sustenance without religion? But the secular society is beginning to run dry for people. Just pure reason isn't enough. And so things begin to emerge. The Dalai Lama is thrown out of Tibet. The first Buddhist monastery is founded in San Francisco. Mindfulness and Buddhism and a sense of getting into a consciousness of compassion and forgiveness begins to grow. All kinds of ways people begin to say, I need to feel something, the sacred in myself, in my body, and who I am. The consciousness movement begins to grow. Eckhart Tolle came forward in the late 90s, writing The Power of Now. So humanity began to say, okay, there's something beyond, it's not the old religions anymore, but it's not just reason. It's not just humans are at the top of the pole managing the world. Kind of actually arrogant, really, in a way. And luckily in the 1980s, I don't know if you all know the story of the ninth principle, but the ninth principle was added at the last minute at the General Assembly, the UU General Assembly that put together all the other principles. At the last minute, someone in the group said, you know, we need something about, I don't know where they found that word, interdependent web, something about the interdependent web. And they threw on the ninth principle at the last minute before they took it to the floor. An interdependent web of which we all are a part. So we were already seeing and feeling that issue. And that's where we are today. We all of a sudden know we're all one. What happens to the one happens to the whole. The bomb being dropped on Japan happened to all of us. Plants around the world in countries spewing off contaminants is happening to us too. Even though we're in Fond du Lac, Madison, Wisconsin, where it's so beautiful and much easier, we know that those things are happening to us too, because after all, now we're dealing with the warmest February in history that we've been keeping in history. So we're affected, all of us. So that is a brief way of thinking about both the history, the science, and the mystical experience, the religion experience, to understanding some of those changes. I want to share the story of David Whyte. Again, I'll ask people, anybody know, he's a poet, David Whyte, less known, I think, a few nods. David Whyte and his wife, he's Scottish, and he was the head of a wonderful school and doing very well, and they had an entire life laid out for them. And in his heart, he felt a tug saying, you must leave all of this safety, security, really, that you've created. It's time for you to go out in the world and create poetry in the corporate world. And he tells his wonderful story that just kind of, it was a hard choice to make, but he felt it in his heart, he believed in his heart, and he proceeded, he and his wife, to do that. And now he writes and works with large groups of corporations to help them find their heart and their soul. I had an experience this morning which reflects on this. I walked out of my apartment in Madison, Wisconsin, and James is my neighbor. James is, 29, and he works at the Apple store. And there I am at 7 a.m. I know why I'm outside at 7 a.m. headed to my car, and I look at it, I said, James, I said, you working this morning? He said, yeah, it's the only time of the week that they can find for us all to meet. And I'm like, Sunday morning? Really? 7:30? He said, yeah. I said, wow. And then, to me, it was such a great example of how corporate world has taken over. I mean, Sunday morning is family time. No matter what you do with it, in a way, I still believe in that. It's still sacred time to spend with your congregation, your family. Apple Store in Madison is calling all their people for a business meeting every Sunday morning at 7 a.m. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. Okay, so back to David Whyte. David Whyte writes about what his experience was of following his heart, and he and his wife, as the path of fire. And this is what he says. In my experience, the more true we are to our own creative gifts, the less there is any outer reassurance or help at the beginning. The more we are on the path, the deeper the silence in the first stages of the process. Following our path is in effect a kind of going off the path through open country. There is a certain early stage when we are left to camp out in the wilderness alone, with a few supporting voices. Out there in the silence, we must build a hearth, gather the twigs, and strike the flint of the fire for ourselves. So this is the call that I have felt. I have totally rearranged my life in the last few years following that. I really believe that in a world where it's so easy to feel hopeless and scared and helpless, because what can we do in Madison, Wisconsin, or Fond du Lac, or wherever we are? I was in Philadelphia. We have no, we're not in charge of big corporations. We're not David White, worldwide poet. What do? Well, we do the most important job there is, which is to look into our heart. What is our heart telling us to do? That's our piece. Every piece in the puzzle matters. You have a big jigsaw puzzle, doesn't matter how many pieces it is. If you have one piece missing, it's not really done, is it? And you have your piece. And it may mean you have healing to do before you do action. It may mean that you go meditate. It may mean that you learn how to play the flute even though you're 81 years old, because you keep thinking about that flute you always wanted to play. For each one of them, no one else can know what's in your heart. And like Eckhart Tolle said, it's probably already engaged in your heart. Good chance it is. Just nurture it a little bit. Just like a house plant. You give it a little water, a little sun, and it'll keep growing. So just give it a little, if you're not ready to do anything grand, which most of us aren't when we begin on this path, just do something simple. Give it a little water. Yeah? My work is called Spiritual Courage, and I'm going to stop now, I realize, because we need to talk. And for me, what that means is helping people find how to access their heart wisdom, body wisdom, their intuitive wisdom. I've already told you, I think the human heart holds the key to the future. Learning how to move from your intuition and have heart-centered relationships and be congruent from the inside out. I have a friend who told me years ago, he said, well, I'm not supposed to be a psychotherapist. I always knew I was supposed to be a writer, but I just didn't think I could make enough money, so I became a psychotherapist. I always knew I should be a writer. He's still not doing it. So he has that peace in him. It's not unusual. We all experience this. I certainly have experienced it my whole life. I'm finally finding my pieces and living them into the world, but I didn't do it for years. I wasn't ready for some reason. There's a whole question of looking at the world through the question of what could be right about what appears to be so wrong, accessing our highest consciousness, learning how to expand ourselves, and put energy into the positive. Working on causes, and it's all very important work. If you're not called to any of that work, if you just create something really positive out of what's in your heart, that'll be huge. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop reading my other things I have, because I'd rather hear from you. So let's just open it up and take a few moments.